Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, December 12th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, and across the Pacific, to some extent, in the Philippines. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, though most Americans are barely aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show that the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world? Not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran. The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the accelerating profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. The American elite's concern for profits has meant that the center of attention for American foreign policy for more than a century has been Eurasia, the landmass from Eastern Europe to East Asia, rather than Europe or the Western Hemisphere. Since at least the end of the 19th century, the U.S. government has been determined to prevent the economic integration of Eurasia under any power, Eastern or Western, for fear that it would hinder the economic exploitation of the world by the American 1%. That's what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about, in the Second World War, conquering their greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. That's why the U.S. left Russia to defeat Hitler alone in 1941, so the U.S. could concentrate on Japan. In World War II as a whole, the U.S. had 500,000 casualties, but Russia lost perhaps 27 million people in defeating Nazi Germany. The bedrock of U.S. foreign policy today remains the containment of Eurasia, Russia and China, and retarding its economic development. The American task is more difficult today at any time since World War II, owing to the effective alliance between Russia and China, and their alliance with other states, notably Iran and Syria. That's why the U.S. has 1,000, yes, 1,000, military bases around Russia and China, while Russia has 15 bases outside its territory, and China has 1. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country on either side. U.S. government plans were described by the State Department policy planning staff in a secret memorandum that pointed out, quote, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction." Close quote. That's the State Department in 1948. Our immediate national objectives since World War II have been economic control of the world. For most of my life, that was presented as a struggle with Russian communism. But we weren't told that the communist bloc never controlled an economy more than half the size of that of the United States. From World War II up to today, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people to maintain that economic control of the world. President Obama was the first U.S. president in history to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. In the campaign, President Trump criticized the 8 wars Obama was conducting, Obama's war provocations against Russia and China, and Obama's drone assassinations, accurately called the greatest terrorist program of modern times. But once in office, Trump has adopted Obama's war policies. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington of 9/11-2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, which began America's longest war. The founders of AWARE saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but it is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over Eurasian economic rivals from Germany to China. The U.S. has been at war almost continuously since World War II, putting down challenges to its economic control of the world. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph of the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, notably Russia, China, Iran, and Syria. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, stop the drone attacks, and end the war provocations against Russia and China. 3, cut military spending by at least 50%, and close the U.S. military bases ringing Russia and China. Bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the world's countries. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. Revoke the Obama administration's trillion-dollar plan to update U.S. nuclear weapons and make them more usable. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by the pro-war U.S. political establishment. We'll try to give a better account tonight, beginning with comments from AWARE's favorite Republican, Ed Mendel.
Oh, hello. Thank you much for your introduction there. Yeah, I suppose, I mean, I'm less scripted than you are, apparently. So I did want to discuss the issue of fake news, which I'm sure is dear to your heart, since you obviously
a lot of it going around.
Well, yeah, I mean, with Chomsky's manufacturing consent, and what's interesting, what I find kind of interesting, actually on several levels. For instance, Rush Limbaugh has actually been quoting Chomsky without realizing it for many years now. He's been mentioning manufacturing, or not exactly using manufacturing consent, manufacturing news. By the media. The media's been manufacturing news. So without realizing he's been quoting, making that comment. I did want to say that I don't believe that, the news media has been making it seem as if Trump has created this issue of fake news. Fake news has been around for decades. For decades. I mean, matter of fact, you can literally go back to when my grandparents were in a crib when they were younger. Literally one of the most famous movies of all time has to do with fake news. All I have to do is say the word rosebudding, and looks like what movie I'm talking about. And it has to do with William Randolph Hearst, with obviously Orson Welles' interpretation of William Randolph Hearst. And this, and that has to do with it. So I find kind of interesting. So the issue of fake news has always been there, and we've had and I think I interpret Trump as being one of the few presidents to actually challenge the media and to challenge, and it's in my I have a little bit a little bit different view of Trump than you do. I do believe that there is a backbone there. Trump is still getting his legs. He's trying to figure it out. In certain ways, it's coming out kind of strange, probably from your perspective. But I do believe that there is the potential there for him to challenge, going back in time and challenging old fake news, if you will, or challenge old accepted agendas from the past. So in my opinion, you literally have to go back to Eisenhower's farewell speech and Teddy Roosevelt and presidents like Chester A. Arthur and then Lincoln, and then we'll go from there. I don't know. I didn't want to get into a discussion of history, but I do consider Trump to be a very rarity, as opposed to an Obama who basically was an empty suit. I would even call it George W. Bush an empty suit. I mean, we've had a series of sort of like empty suits in their own way, of people who more or less they got by because they were related to previous presidents, or related or just because they got along, or they had no backbone in their own way. But yeah, no, I feel as if. I did want to discuss. I mean, you could feel free to engage in this, but I do feel that fake news has always been present. And obviously, I know that you believe that Chomsky, the news from Neptune, obviously I'm sorry.
I agree with that, Ed, in the sense that as I look back on my own political education, I'm actually amazed at my present age at what a false account we got of news of the world in the generation, the baby boomer generation I grew up in.
Well, the Vietnam War.
The whole Cold War. The whole Cold War was misrepresented from the beginning.
Yes.
It was all fake news. I mean, Americans were told as a quite conscious government program from the years after the Second World War, that the communists were about to descend on Europe or on the United States, and therefore the U.S. needed a huge military budget and eventually a great system of nuclear weapons in order to defend the U.S. and Europe against this this threat from the East.
Let me ask you a question, Carl. I mean, in World War II, Russia lost a lot of people, and they lost a lot of men and women in World War II. And I believe what they actually did, what actually happened with the Cold War, they had to create a barrier nations between them and the rest of the world to protect themselves from that happening again. And
that's a good point.
So I don't know if that's another reinterpretation of what actually happened following World War II, rather than they were seizing control. They lost a horrific number of people, and they didn't want that to happen again. They were trying to protect themselves, just like we were trying to protect ourselves in our own way, so to speak. Whatever.
Yeah, I would agree with that, except with the last phrase, just the way we were going to protect ourselves. I don't think that's true. Yeah. I don't think it was symmetrical.
Okay.
If you look at the world from Moscow in 1945.
Well, George Patton wanted to continue the battle into Russia, I understand. Yes.
Well, yes, because the point of view of the United States government was that the war was an opportunity for the U.S. to make its economic control of the world final.
Yep.
The U.S. was the only undamaged country to come out of the Second World War. Mm-hmm. The others, winners and losers, were all damaged substantially by it. And this wasn't I mean, we sometimes think of American planners, and we also sometimes concentrate it down on the president, as being stupid and sort of blundering into things. Mm-hmm. These guys are not dumb. Mm-hmm. They're vicious. That's different. And what they're doing has a good deal of sense behind it. The U.S., from before the time the U.S. actually entered the war, after Pearl Harbor, mm-hmm. the U.S. government was planning on the outcome of the war, was planning on the dominant position that the United States would have in the world after the war was over. Regardless of that, they considered various possibilities of how it would end. With Germany, in fact, reducing Russia, with Germany being the dominant country in Europe, with the possibility that Germany would lose. That was still discussed quite honestly, if secretly, in the American government before the U.S. ever joined the war. The planning for the war even had a name. They called it Grand Area Planning. Grand Area Planning went on in the State Department and the American government, secretly, of course, from the late 1930s on, when it was clear to everyone a war was coming. The U.S. talked about, how do we end up on top of the heap?
Yeah.
And that piece that I read in the opening from the policy planning staff of the State Department in 1948 was an outcome of almost a decade of planning for the post-war world.
Well, even the following the post-war world was kind of strange because it involved to a certain degree it involved the splitting up of the Nazis, the Nazi scientists. We took control of Werner von Braun with the Nazi and the space program and it's kind of interesting how we were trying to defeat them, but we were trying to take possession of certain parts of the German
Oh yeah.
And then in a strange way we became part of what the Nazis believed in, and we just kind of bizarre. We continued I think a Block Island off the coast of Long Island. We considered the experimentations that the Nazis were doing, so it was kind of strange.
Look, I mean, if you get a little historical distance on 1945, it becomes clear that the U.S. switched sides at the end of the war.
Yeah.
The war, in the war as a whole, the U.S. and Russia were, the Soviet Union, were allies against Japan and Germany.
Yes, we were, supposedly.
When the war ended, the U.S. became Russia's declared enemy and allied with Japan and Germany.
Yeah, very strange.
Who changed? What happened?
Do you think that was created on purpose for the multi-industrial complex, which Eisenhower warned about?
Yes, exactly. It was certainly on purpose. I mean, we even have, there's a famous interview between famous account of a discussion between Senator Arthur Vandenberg and the new president, Harry Truman, at the end of the war.
Right.
What the American government had been involved in the Grand Area Planning for the last almost 10 years before that, what the American government really feared after the end of the Second World War was not an attack from Russia. What it feared was the return of the Depression. Mm-hmm. The Depression of the 1930s, the Great Depression, the worst in American history, had been ended not by the New Deal programs, which helped. They definitely helped people of all sorts, like Social Security and workmen's compensation and things like that. But the Depression, as a business cycle, was ended only by war production. It was only when the factories began humming again to make tanks and planes, and people were being employed, that the Depression of the 1930s came to an end. So what was going to happen? What was going to happen when the war ended? American planners looked at that and said, look, the war cured the Depression, the war's gone, the war is over, the Depression will be back. Yeah. And how are we going to handle that? The answer was create wartime conditions. Find an enemy, it was the Soviet Union, who would play the role of Germany and Japan, who are now no longer enemies. Find an enemy and get war production going, the military-industrial complex you talked about, get war production going. How am I going to do that, said Harry Truman to Senator Vandenberg. Senator Vandenberg said, you're going to scare hell out of the American people.
And they've been doing that. I mean,
exactly.
It was Operation Northwood and trying to create this, obviously with the false flag operation, which I believe the false flag operation of 2001, the space up in 2001, they created the war on terrorism, almost like a permanent war on a concept.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And when you create a permanent war on concept, it can never end because the concept is imaginary. I mean, it's sort of like, whatever you define the terrorist as, and it'll last forever.
And it was only by producing enemies, real and imagined, that this sort of war production that the U.S. invented during the Second World War could be continued, and it has been continued to this day.
Yes.
And it's system that at any historical distance is not going to reflect much credit on the United States of America.
Well, I'm still hopeful that Trump will figure it out. I mean, I don't know.
Much more of an optimist than I.
I suppose. I mean, I like as a previous presidents, I had no confidence at all. And now, in retrospect, I think well. Yeah.
Well, it's worthwhile to learn that, I think. I mean, you started off with a reflection on the fake news meme that people are excited about, right? What I'm suggesting is the whole Cold War and the economy, the American economy that grew out of it, was fake news. And consciously so. The U.S. government didn't say, "Oh my goodness, we thought Russia was an enemy, but we were wrong." No, it wasn't that at all.
It was
it was a conscious, calculated construction, a construction that was there to scare hell out of the American people and convince them to build an economy that was dominated by the military-industrial complex. You're quite right.
Also, before we leave this conversation, I also want to mention I want to introduce a new term, believe it or not, something called sheepdogging. I noticed that when you have conversations online and you try to introduce a new interpretation of a dialogue. They say, "Oh no, that's a tinfoil hat. Get back on conversation here." And I'm almost going to interpret that as sheepdogging. What?
How do you mean that?
I mean, people try. I mean, I noticed that conversations are always being contained, so that the conversation you are always on the plantation of acceptable ideas, if you will, rather than people introducing the truth and or reality from out which happens to exist out off the plantation of ideas, if you will, and that people are the slave of the media's agenda, if you will, of the interpretation of facts of any number of stories which we consider under the category of fake news.
I think that's right. I mean, it's the remark that Noam Chomsky, who our program on News from Neptune is named in honor of, is appropriate here. He said years ago, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient, he's talking about the American public in regard to these political matters, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
But allow very lively debate within that spectrum.
Right.
Get Republicans and Democrats yelling at one another about what the appropriate way to oppose Soviet communism is.
Well,
even encourage the more critical and dissident views, says Chomsky. That gives people the sense there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits on the range on the range of debate. That's what happened. That's what happened in the Cold War in the United States, and that's what the attempt to control the news in the current generation is about.
Yes. I just find it kind of sad the fact that people they almost think that this as a news conversation, whereas it actually it's been a dialogue that's been going on for a long time.
That's right.
And unfortunately, I could bring up an endless number of fake news from decades ago. So this has been going on forever, and I think what's happening for me personally is I'm unfortunately when I first met you, many years ago, my politics was quite different. It was different. Now I'm in a different paradigm now, and so I'm coming to grips with the fact that certain things that you've said and you've been telling me are in fact correct. Well, I don't agree with your with certain aspects of your politics. I'm sorry.
No. That's what makes horse racing.
Yeah, I suppose. I am still confident that Trump is part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
Tell me, I'd like you to enlarge on that point in a minute, but before you do that, tell me how you would describe your politics today.
Well, I suppose it's any number of things that have changed me. I suppose Ron Paul. I suppose going back in time, Ross Perot. The RP thing. So I almost interpret Trump as being the second coming, if you will, of Ross Perot. And so, from my perspective, I interpret Trump not as a Republican, I interpret him as a third-party candidate who was taking over the White House.
I think there's something to that.
Even though he is technically a Republican, yeah. But so my interpretation of what he's about is quite different than what he's being portrayed as.
One of the effects of the fake news problem that you raised to start tonight is that we're left without good labels for positions. To say someone is a conservative these days, for example, doesn't really betray too much. Is he a conservative like Pat Buchanan? Is he a conservative like Donald Trump? Is he a conservative like... judge in Alabama.
More or less.
Are there? I mean, there are modifications and variations there that take explaining. The term paleoconservative is used for describing people. I mentioned Buchanan, but the website antiwar.com, which I think is very good. Okay. I would say includes a lot of positions that certainly in recent American political talk would be called left. Yeah. They call themselves conservatives, but not conservatives of the usual sort. Certainly not neoconservatives, which means something entirely different. They call themselves paleoconservatives, where they're talking about that tradition of non-interventionism going back to Robert Taft. Yeah. This view is it doesn't have a recognized label in current description. For many years, I called myself a libertarian socialist, but I was using libertarian not in Ron Paul's sense, although I have admiration for many of the things that Ron Paul has said recently here, not for the most part on economics. Okay. But libertarian has an older meaning, a 19th century meaning, a European meaning, which means what's closer to what we might call democratic today. Democratic, lowercase d, that means popularly directed, even populist. A libertarian, as the 19th century would have understood the term, would be someone that might be called a populist today. So the confusion is rife. Libertarian socialism, which is equated with anarchism in 19th century discussion, would be the position that I would have embraced, I would have used as a label some time ago, but I don't dare do that anymore because libertarian has taken on a different meaning, and socialism has lost all sense of the great socialist tradition that goes back once again for more than a century. I thought one of the most interesting effects of the recent presidential election was the Sanders campaign for all of the positions that Bernie Sanders took that in many ways I'm critical of, particularly on foreign policy. Sanders did reintroduce the word socialist to American political discussion. And that is new. That is different. But I still am left in the position of trying to say, well, when I say libertarian socialist as a description of my position, I mean historic anarchism, but not in the Antifa sense. The word anarchism has been taken over by the Antifa people, and it's useless for all practical purposes because, of course, that's not something I want to embrace.
I actually think the Antifa is actually a fascist group. The
word fascist, of all the words to have been used and misused, misinterpreted and misunderstood, and not innocently, purposely, on all sides, it seems the word fascist. If one, before the current discussion began in this country a few years ago, the argument among historians about how to characterize early 20th century fascism in Europe was quite serious. They could not, in fact, come up with an agreement. They just pointed to examples. They say, when I mean fascism, I mean the National Socialists in Germany, I mean Mussolini's party in Italy, and maybe sometimes Franco in Spain. But that was the best you can do in the attempt to abstract a description a general description of what counts as fascism and make it useful in American political conversation was useless.
It's anybody who disagrees with you.
Yeah, exactly.
You're the
It really
fascist.
that became pretty close to that.
Yeah.
So when you ask someone what their politics are these days, we suffer from not perhaps an absence of abstract terms, but a surfeit of abstract terms, none of which we agree on as far as meaning is concerned.
Yeah.
So, if you say, what are the, how you describe your political position,
Yeah.
I have to reply, libertarian socialist, Chomskyan anarchist, not Antifa, you understand.
Yeah.
But sort of, and it takes me a paragraph to get there.
I would have to get the paragraph to describe where the hell I am.
Well, that's what I thought. That's what I was suggesting.
Wow, because I'm definitely not a strident Republican. I would just say or conservative. It's just. I mean, I do know that there are some aspects of what you believe in I totally disagree with. Your economic issues, I think, are but I didn't want to go into the discussion of those issues, but I'll just mention that we are quite different.
Well, and
I did want to mention before I left this show here, one of the things I do like about Trump is actually his tweeting. I do like the fact that he is tweeting. Is literally circumnavigating the agenda of the media, and that's driving them crazy because for decades mass media has always controlled the agenda of the paradigm of acceptable conversation, whereas now his tweeting has literally he's able to insert his ideas and with the authority of the White House to create dialogue on subject matter, which is like, you can't discuss that. So what are you doing? And so I actually like that aspect of Trump, believe it or not. I don't know if you would agree with that.
I do, to the point. I think there may be far more important things about Trump, and maybe even more important things than that about his enemies.
Yeah, I won't.
But I think I don't think you're wrong, particularly when we contrast it with his predecessor. When we think about Barack Obama, I'm reminded of a phrase that turns up in the Knox translation of the Bible, where there's a reference to covering sin with smooth names.
Yes.
Now, it's a fairly inventive translation from the Hebrew, but it's a good phrase because Barack Obama seems to me to be the past master of covering sin with smooth names, and the contrast with Trump is great. Trump can't say something that repeats what his predecessors said without finding a way to do it that outrages at least half the electorate.
I would say we've had a series of empty suits. I mean, so I'm basically saying a similar thing to what you're saying, smooth voice of Obama. But I would say we've had empty suits, people that are going along with the agenda or are timid or maybe on purpose they're timid. They're saying, okay, well, whatever you say, I'll go along with it. George W. Bush, Clinton, and you can go back to George Bush Sr. and you go back in time to a large degree. You can, but yeah, of presidents who are not willing to upset the apple cart. But I do see Trump as potentially he's there. Of really, it's like, that's the reason why they're trying to disable him in different ways of trying to do conversation to impeach him and to get him out of office, to say he's crazy or get him up the So I see that as that people are truly upset with him, and that upset is actually making me happy in certain ways. Well, I like that upset. I like the fact that he's challenging some deeper state thing that is upsetting their ability to the globalism, if you will. And I believe I think he's challenging the United Nations. I mean, which following I don't know if you agree with the United Nations with their globalist agenda following World War II, and we're going to go back to that again. But
well, this this is an important point. The Trump administration came into office with two major lines of interpretation represented by Trump's chief aides, Gary Cohn, who had been president of Goldman Sachs and was not a stranger to American capitalism, and Steve Bannon,
Yep.
who has been this hate object for so many people who did not like Trump, the Trump administration. They saw Steve Bannon as the evil genius, the ominous gris behind the Trump throne. But what people, I think, didn't pay too much attention to is that these two men represented very different lines, political lines, that influenced the Trump administration. Gary Cohn, the ex-banker, represented corporate globalism. You mentioned the notion of globalism a moment ago.
Yes.
Basically, the neoliberal program that grew up quite consciously in the 1970s when American business decided there was too much democracy around, and they had to put capitalism, put capital, put money back into command, offshore the economy, send jobs abroad, destroy unions, destroy the tendency to democratize the American economy that had grown up with the Vietnam War. That was the globalist program. That was the corporate globalist program that Cohn represented. On the other side, Steve Bannon represented another vision, a vision that he called economic nationalism. And what he meant was that the American middle class, the majority of the American population, had been immiserated over the last 40 years by neoliberalism. The life chances, economic life chances that they saw their parents as having had were no longer there. And that the growth in inequality, the figures are undeniable, the growth of inequality, I mean economic inequality, in American society had been overwhelming in the period from the 1970s to the present. Wages in the United States today are at the same level they were in 1973, even though they'd risen on upward from the end of the Second World War to the 70s. Now, it's that contrast, the corporate globalism, policy run in the interest of the 1% on the one hand, and economic nationalism, economic policy run in the interest of the majority, that influenced the Trump administration, because it was the perception that Trump stood for the latter that got a lot of people who had voted for hope and change with Obama not to vote for Clinton, on the grounds that the hope and change turned out to be false.
Would you say that Trump sort of like secretly took over a lot of union votes because because I think a lot of the union people are saying, wait a second now, we actually agree with what Trump is saying.
That this is exactly right. It was the
even though they traditionally voted for the Democratic Party, say, wait a second now, this is kind of strange situation here.
Obama was revealed as a pro-war, pro-Wall Street president. In spite of all the hope.
I was referring to Hillary.
And Hillary was following on that directly as a pro-war, pro-Wall Street candidate. What Trump did, however consciously, we don't need to decide, was to attack the pro-war and pro-Wall Street policies of the Obama-Clinton administration. Your comment about the unionists and so forth. Now, in office, Trump seems to have gone back to those pro-war, pro-Wall Street policies. We keep hoping, you and I in different ways, I think perhaps, that those original impulses may turn out to be effective in some way.
I still see traces of hope there. Maybe you won't see
Once again, you're more hopeful than I. But
hope and change. I'm just kidding.
There we go. But it was the fact that it was the fact that the Obama voters who wanted hope and change sat on their hands rather than voting for Hillary when it became clear that Hillary was a pro-war Wall Street candidate, and Trump was attacking that made Trump president.
Yes,
and that's the micro politics of the Trump administration. The macro politics, that is what the Trump administration actually does in office, is a much less happy story, because what they've done with the tremendous pressure of the political establishment is to revert to the policies of the Obama administration and the Bush administration, as far as that goes, in regard to war in the economy. Now, you and I, as I say, in different ways, keep hoping hoping that those germs will fructify.
Well,
I'm not sure they will.
Since he's gotten into office, he's been in so many battles and internal battles to control the agenda and from different angles that I think he's like his victories are coming like slow and so I just feel that it's going to take time. Hopefully, it will happen within 8 years. That he will get to where we saying, okay, well, he gets it. I mean, so but I just feel that I think the potential is there. I honestly, I'm being serious with you. I do see the potential there for him to come around.
Well, it's your splendid optimism that makes me want to put you on the program, Ed, so I'm glad to hear it. But I hope you're right. And I have a piece here that
video.
No, not video. We may not have time for the excellent video that we had planned for today.
Yeah.
But hey, look. Unfortunately, there will be other opportunities because things are not solved.
Yeah.
What I have here is something that grows out of our discussion about political descriptions.
Yeah.
What do you say your politics are? Years ago, long ago, Phil Oakes, the late folk singer, had a song entitled "Love Me, I'm a Liberal." That raised the question of what liberal meant in American politics, a term that has changed even since Oakes' time. But he began the song by saying, in American communities today, there are many shades of political opinions. One of the shadiest is the liberals. 10 degrees to the right of center in bad times, 10 degrees to the left of center and when it... I said that badly. 10 degrees to the left of center in good times, 10 degrees to the right of center when it affects them personally. The liberals are a particularly sneaky bunch, he thinks.
I think they've gotten into trouble because of that, because, I mean, they love me because I'm a liberal. Then you have to be have the Harvey Weinsteins and they've gotten off the beaten trail. I was like, whoa. I don't know if you want to go there, but I just
We've said for a long time on our program, News from Neptune, that the poets often get there first. Even in political matters, they often don't realize where they've got to. But I have a poet this week who has gotten there and realizes where he's gotten. His name is C.J. Hopkins. He's an American who lives in Germany, and he wrote a piece called "The Year of the Headless Liberal Chicken." The headless liberal chicken is based on the notion of people running around in hysteria like chickens with their heads cut off. And he says that's where American liberals have been this year, 2017. And he tries to explain why that's true. He says, according to the Chinese zodiac, 2017 has been the year of the rooster. Myself, I've decided to designate it the year of the headless liberal chicken. I don't mean that to be insulting, or all right, I guess I do a little. But my heart goes out to liberals, seriously. At this point, the amount of utterly baseless, contradictory propaganda, mass hysteria, and just flat-out insanity the ruling classes have demanded they swallow is more than any human mind, no matter how medicated, can possibly handle. Is it any wonder so many of them, these liberals, lost it and started seeing Nazis and Russians coming out of the woodwork? Just consider what the average liberal has been forced to try to cognitively reconcile since the tragic events of last November. Now, Hopkins, by the tragic of last November, refers to the election of Trump. But he says, think about the problems the liberals have had since then. First came the overwhelming shock of Hillary Clinton's loss to Trump, a repulsive word salad babbling buffoon with absolutely no political experience, who the media has been portraying to liberals as the second coming of Adolf Hitler. I actually think the best interpretation of Trump is as a carnival barker. Well, I'm not sure that Hopkins, who's a playwright by profession, would disagree with you.
There you go.
This was a candidate, let's recall, who jabbered about building a beautiful wall to protect us from the hordes of Mexican rapists and other bad hombres who were invading America, and who had boasted about grabbing women like a prepubescent sixth-grade boy.
Yeah.
While he had served as a perfect foil for Clinton and had provided hours of entertainment in a comic book villain kind of way, the prospect of a Donald Trump presidency was inconceivable in the minds of liberals. So when it happened, it was like the Martians had invaded. Mass hysteria gripped the nation. There was beaucoup wailing and gnashing of teeth. Liberals began exhibiting, Coppin's my age, and therefore that Vietnam word turns up. Huh? Mm-hmm. Liberals began exhibiting irrational and in some cases rather disturbing behaviors. Many degenerated into dissociative states and just sat there with their phones for hours, obsessively reloading the popular vote count, which Clinton had won, on 538. If that reference, 538 is a liberal website that was concerned about,
electoral votes,
vote counting.
Right.
And turn up tonight on the Alabama election.
Yeah, well,
Others festooned themselves with safety pins and went out looking for defenseless minorities whom they could demonstrate solidarity with. Owen Jones flew in from London to join his colleague Stephen Thrasher. These are two liberal columnists, one British and one American, who was organizing a guerrilla force to resist, quote, the normalization of Trump, close quote. That was an interesting phrase. That's what had to be fought, the normalization of Trump. And the global race war he was about to launch, which not all of us were going to get out of alive, close quote. He's quoting these liberals he talks about there. In the weeks immediately following the election, the mainstream media inundated liberals with pronouncements of the advent of an age of darkness and the triumph of white supremacy over the beneficent values of globalism.
Can I insert something here?
Sure.
I want you to lose your place in your dialogue here. I do notice the fact that following the election, the Democratic Party basically eviscerated the progressive wing of that party out of control of the Democratic Party. But it was Tom Perez won.
Yes.
And on the Rules Committee, they got rid of all the Bernie Sanders on the Rules Committee.
That's right.
And so literally they've eviscerated the progressive movement from the Democratic Party.
That's quite right.
And it's kind of interesting that you're saying that their enemy is Trump. Well, I think the Democratic enemy is actually even closer to them than they think it is.
Once again, the problem is the old line in the theater, is satire is what closes on Saturday night.
Yeah.
That is, people, the attempt to try to do satire usually ends up in offending far more people than you attract. Yeah. This C.J. Hopkins here has produced, I think, the best satire of the current American political scene that I have seen in a while, and it's a satire, of course, of the liberal position. And it seems to me that the task of trying to understand what's happened in recent American politics may, in fact, be successfully done this way, but it's hard. It's difficult.
Do you think the progressive movement or the liberal, I guess, maybe even the unions are being driven out of the Democratic Party and they're being driven into some other party or some other? Because I almost get the impression they want to create either another third party or to go to the Green Party or to.
I think it makes a difference whether you talk about the unions as the conservative organizations that they actually are, with the present leadership of American. The American labor movement. I mean, it's a long story about how the American labor movement in the 20th century became a right-wing movement.
I was just going to say that there seems to be a split between the labor movement has always automatically endorsed the Democratic Party candidate,
exactly.
no matter what.
That's right.
And now I do get the impression, listening to different sources, that there is a saying, well, we've had enough. That it's over. It really, really is over. Well, now I'm wondering where are they going to go?
Well, I think it's a very good question because there's a contrast, and has been for a while, but is perhaps more obvious now, between the rank and file of the American labor movement, such as it exists, and its leadership.
Yes.
And the people that Steve Bannon is talking about as economic nationalists are the people who have lost jobs in the last generation, who've lost the economic standing that they had grown up to expect. The people who would normally be the staffing, would be filling the ranks of those unions. And the notion that that will produce a revolt against the union leadership, I think, is a very real possibility. Union membership has been declining with the rise of neoliberalism quite remarkably, but in some ways the same impulses that took people into unions in the 1950s now make up what Bannon calls economic nationalism. I don't think the last has been heard of them, and they, in some ways, elected Trump.
Yes, I don't disagree with you there. You want to continue? Sorry.
In the weeks immediately following the election, the mainstream media inundated liberals with pronouncements of the advent of an age of darkness and the triumph of white supremacy over the beneficent values of globalism. Yes, it was pretty much the end of everything. America was facing nothing less than a descent into racial Orwellianism referring to the author of the novel 1984, Zionist anti-Semitism, it's a neat trick and needs to be described more fully, and the bottomless pit of fascism. There's the word du jour. Liberals, who by then had dispensed with the safety pins, immediately set about terrorizing their children with visions of the impending Holocaust, which would be carried out by the genocidal, racist monsters who had voted for Trump. At that point, the media had been hammering hard on the Trump is Hitler narrative for months, so they had to stick with that for a while. It had only been a few weeks, after all, since the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and numerous other establishment publications had explained how Trump was using special fascist code words like global elites, international banks, and lobbyists to signal his virulent hatred of the Jews to millions of Americans who, according to the media, were secretly Hitler-loving fascists. The initial post-election propaganda was understandably somewhat awkward, as the plan had been to be able to celebrate the triumph of love over the forces of hate and the demise of the latest Hitlerian boogeyman. But this was the risk the ruling classes took when they chose to go ahead and Hitlerize Trump, which they wouldn't have done if they'd thought for a moment they had a chance of actually winning the election. That's the tricky thing about Hitlerizing people. You need to be able to kill them eventually. If you don't, when they turn out not to be Hitler, your narrative kind of falls apart, and the people you fear-mongered into a frenzy of frothing, self-righteous, fake Hitler hatred end up feeling like a bunch of dupes who believe anything the government tells them. This is why, normally, you only Hitlerize foreign despots you can kill with impunity. Saddam Hussein, for example. This is Hitlerization 101 stuff, which the ruling classes ignored in this case, which the left, poor liberals, terrified that Trump was actually going to start building Trump-branded death camps and rounding up the Jews. Fortunately, just in the nick of time, the ruling classes and their media mouthpieces rolled out the Russian propaganda story. The Washington Post, whose owner's multi-million-dollar deal with the CIA, of course, had absolutely no effect on the quality of its professional journalism, led the charge that this McCarthyite smear job, legitimizing the baseless allegations of some random website and a think tank staffed by charlatans like this Russia expert, who appears not to speak a word of Russian or have any other Russian expert credentials, but is available both for television and Senate Intelligence Committee appearances. Numerous similar smear pieces followed. Liberals breathed a big sigh of relief. That Hitler business had been getting kind of scary. How long can you go, after all, with Hitler stumbling around the White House before somebody has to go in there and shoot him? In any event, by January, the media were playing down the Hitler stuff and going all out on the Russiagate story. According to the Washington Post, which, let's remember, is a serious newspaper as opposed to a propaganda organ of the so-called U.S. intelligence community. Not only had the Russian, I like that particularly, I grew up reading the Washington Post when it was obvious to everyone it was the propaganda organ of the U.S. intelligence community, the CIA primarily in those days. Not only had the Russians hacked the election, but they'd hacked the Vermont power grid. Editorialists at the New York Times were declaring that Trump had been appointed by Putin. That's what the New York Times said. And that the U.S. was now at war with Russia. This was also around the time when liberals first learned of the Trump-Russia dossier, which detailed how Putin was blackmailing Trump. With a video, the FSB, the Russian secret police, had shot of Trump and a bunch of Russian hookers in a Moscow hotel in which Obama had allegedly slept. That's quite a switch, as he points out, Hopkins points out, from Trump the Hitler, Trump the Nazi, to Trump the Russian puppet. It was accomplished in less than a month. Quite a remarkable enterprise, but it suggests the way in which the election of Trump had driven the American liberal political establishment mad.
Yes.
And that madness seems to me to be the sorts of things that we have to disentangle ourselves from before we can be talking about politics really in this country.
I wonder if the madness is being inspired by the fact, by the realization that they're losing power. They've lost.
I think that's exactly
they've
right.
lost control of the agenda.
That's exactly right.
They always assumed they would always have control of the agenda, of the minds of the American, well, not the American people, of the world community. Now they're losing that power. They're losing the globalism power. They're losing a lot of their wars and something that. So Trump is literally undoing a lot of a lot of their victories of the past, and the assumption that Hillary Clinton was the perfect pawn to say, you do this, okay, I'll do this,
Yep.
and do this, and she would be actually Hillary Clinton would have been the perfect puppet. Trump is not the puppet. Trump is almost like something out of the Twilight Zone. Something the puppets can take control.
Trump is erratic, and that Clinton could be relied on as a warmonger is what sent all the neoconservatives into the Clinton campaign.
Before this is over, I did want to mention that there's going to be a forum at the Champaign Library by the Democrats.
Good.
I was hoping that you would mention, because I don't know if I care one way or the other.
Good of you to be so Catholic in your taste here.
But something to do with Illinois 13, I guess. But there'll be some sort of a Democratic forum at the Champaign Public Library at 7 p.m. this Thursday, a couple of days from now. Yeah.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 50th week of 2017. Another week in which the world concedes the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. See No's notes on the blog newsfromneptune.com. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scholarly. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. See the Facebook page for Aware with the full article that I was reading from before. And we were planning to conclude tonight with a video of some history that few Americans know that we were talking about at the beginning of the program. This video is entitled Undoing the New Deal, Truman's Cold War, Buries Wallace and the Left. That, too, I will put on the Facebook page for Aware, and I recommend it highly. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook and Ed Mandel for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Burrough, good night and good luck.